I'm David Hutchins with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, the international community condemns what appears to be the worst 48-hour carnage in the Syrian uprising so far. Some are calling it a massacre. Our reporter gets confronted by protesters in Tahrir as pro-SCAF and enraged women march during runoff elections. And VOA's interview with Yemeni Nobel Peace Prize winner Tawakkol Karman. It's all ahead on Voice of America. The opposition Syrian National Council has urged the United Nations Security Council and the Arab League to take action after reports that government troops, quote, massacred more than 200 people in 2 days. The Opposition Council today called for an emergency UN meeting to discuss the recent killings in Zawiya Mountain, Idlib, and Homs. It urged the UN to declare these areas safe zones and force Syrian troops to withdraw. The opposition grouping says 250 people have died in a 48-hour period, making it one of the deadliest times since the anti-government uprising began in March. An activist with the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights told VOA Tuesday that troops surrounded and attacked civilians, including activists, in the Idlib province village of Kafruid. In one instance, the London-based group told VOA security forces beheaded the leader of a local mosque. Witnesses also told the observatory that troops besieged a group of army deserters in Idlib, killing or wounding as many as 100. The observatory's claims cannot be independently confirmed because Syria has restricted foreign journalists in the country. Now, joining me by phone now, North American spokesperson for the local coordination committees of Syria. Her name is Rafeef Jujati. The LCC monitors what is happening on the ground in Syria, like the SOHR, and they document civilian deaths that are recorded by a consortium of activist groups. Welcome, Rafeef, again.
Thanks for having me.
Also joining me is senior reporter Cecily Hillary. Rafeef, I want to start with you. What is the latest you can tell us about the carnage in Idlib and the Zawiya Mountains and Homs?
What I know is that more than 250 people have been massacred in the area, and there were an approximate 3,000 villagers who fled the area. They're hiding in olive groves to avoid being massacred.
Rafeef, why now? This is one day before observers are supposed to, at least the initial team, come into Syria to take a look at what's going on. Why this crackdown now?
That's a really good question, Cecily. The crackdown has been going on, as you know, for about 10 months now. So this is just a continuation of the regime's massacre of its own people. I think we're seeing larger numbers of defections, and that may be a reason for them to accelerate some of the killings. It may be that they're trying to crush the protest by any means necessary before the observers arrive.
Is there any particular case, Rafeef, that you heard of today that crystallizes the amount of brutality that civilians are witnessing?
What I'm hearing is that in Idlib and in other parts of Syria, they're beginning to use children as human shields so that they can go in, surround villages and towns, and start shelling on civilians. This is the latest I've been hearing. It seems to be escalating in savagery.
Rafeef, you and I talked by phone a little earlier today. You used a phrase that really got my attention. You said it's not genocide yet, but it's been a massacre of genocidal proportions.
I wouldn't say yet, Cecily. Genocide, strictly defined, it really is limited to a particular ethnicity. I don't think this is limited to ethnicity or religious sect. In fact, I would say that the Assad regime is non-sectarian in that they will kill anybody. It doesn't matter what religion or ethnicity or background one is from. It is reaching genocidal proportion in that we have close to 6,000 people documented as having been killed. We've got more than 50,000 people in prison, and there are 40,000 plus people who have been forcibly disappeared. So you're talking about close to 100,000 people. That is of genocidal proportion.
Reports attacks come as foreign observers prepare to enter Syria in an effort to end the 9 months of bloody unrest. The UN says at least 5,000 people have been killed. This is their figures during the 9-month uprising against Assad. The Syrian authorities blame the violence on armed terrorist groups. Arab League officials, the pre-team, are supposed to arrive tomorrow. Moving on to Egypt. Egypt's foreign minister says his country will not accept foreign interference in its internal affairs. This follows U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's harsh condemnation of the recent treatment of women there. Foreign Minister Mohammed Kamal Amr said today Cairo was seeking clarification concerning statements made by foreign officials. On Monday, Clinton said the violence in Egypt was shocking and served as a systematic degradation of women. Protesters have called for a mass rally this Friday to demand an apology for the attacks on women. Soldiers have beaten female protesters, dragged them by their hair, and in some cases pulled off their clothing. The military council said Tuesday it regretted the attacks on the women and said it would take legal action against those responsible for the abuse. 5 days of clashes between security forces and protesters in Cairo's Tahrir Square have killed at least 14 people as demonstrators call for an end to Egypt's military rule. Joining me on the line now is freelance reporter Noelle King, filing for VOA from Cairo. Thanks, Noelle, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, you just returned from Tahrir Square doing a report, and it got a little scary. Can you tell us what happened?
That's right. It's a tense time in Tahrir Square right now. There are people down there who are clearly supportive of and sympathetic of the military government, and there are others who have taken the side of the protesters or the activists. I had interviewed people from both sides, and at one point I was doing an interview with an older gentleman. Two other men understood or heard that I worked for Voice of America, brought over another half dozen men, and two of them who spoke English said to me that, Americans were not wanted there, and they had some very harsh words for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. They told me that they believed her comments about the Egyptian military cracking down harshly on Egyptian women were completely unnecessary, and that she didn't know what she was talking about. And they said in the future we wish that she would refrain from making any comments at all about the Egyptian military. She doesn't understand them, they said.
Now, also, we should remind people, the television video in the last few days have shown soldiers beating female protesters, some in full clothing, pulling that clothing off, exposing their undergarments, and hitting them while they're on the ground. Now, these men, maybe they're not in support of this, but they're basically saying the military is needed. But there's been a counter-protest of women who are actually drawing attention to the fact that this has happened. Have you seen any presence of people upset with the military and in support of the women down in Tahrir?
Yes, of course. And yesterday's rally, I should say, by Egyptian women was really striking because of the numbers and the fact that Egyptian women of all facets of society all turned out. Today down in Tahrir Square, there were several people who said that they were sympathetic to Egyptian women. Egyptian protesters in general, nobody really singled the women out, but you got the impression that people were really on one side or the other. It was we're pro-activist or we're pro-military.
Now we're in another phase of the elections with a runoff election happening. Are the protests on either side affecting how the elections are being run?
Well, they are. For the most part, today was calm, and the elections went ahead as scheduled, as they have done so far. What this has done more than affect things logistically is it's cast something of a shadow on these elections. People have turned out in droves in overwhelming and unexpected numbers, which is a great thing for Egypt. The problem is when you see the kind of violence that we've seen for the past 5 or 6 days, it tends to draw attention away from the fact that this country actually is taking amazing strides toward democracy, and focus that attention on some of the negative things that are happening, which are contained to the city center.
Now, it seems like SCAF or the military on the street always seem to be on the verge every few days of a miscalculation. In this case, what happened with the women, they were unapologetic for about a day until they saw there was a counter movement against it. How damaging is the footage, the fact that women were beaten, and solidifying the idea that the military is still a symbol of this old Egypt, this oppressive Egypt?
I think in many ways the footage of what happened to that woman whose underclothes were exposed, I think that may have been one of the more damaging things that the military council has done to itself over the past couple of months even. I think for the most part, Egyptians are still on the side of the military. They do believe that the military is the thing that will keep this country in control, keep the economy on track and keep things from spiraling into anarchy. But when you have video evidence like you did this past weekend of that woman who was beaten in the street, it's impossible to ignore that something absolutely terrible was done.
We'll have to leave it there. Freelance reporter Noel King talking to us from Cairo. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Yemeni activist who shared the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize says the democracy movement she helps to lead will continue in spite of the transition plan developed by the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, and that was endorsed by the international community. VOA's Al Pessin spoke to Tawakkul Karman recently in London.
Hundreds of thousands of Yemenis have marched for freedom in all corners of the country this year, eventually forcing President Ali Abdullah Saleh to agree to step down. But the process he agreed to calls for an end to the demonstrations and sit-ins. That is something Nobel Peace Prize winner Tawakkul Karman says will not happen.
Of course not. People will continue their peaceful revolution until they reach all their demands and goals.
The transition plan would put Mr. Saleh's vice president into power. Karman calls it undemocratic, corrupt, and contrary to everything the revolutionaries have been protesting, fighting, and dying for.
We will stay in the squares until we reach to the new country, democracy country, and modern country.
It has been a long road for Tawakkul Karman, 6 years of writing and protesting, and the past year living in a tent on Sanaa's main square. Now that foreign leaders are listening to what she says, she wants them to freeze the assets of the Saleh regime and prosecute the president at the International Court of Justice.
I trust them, and I believe that they will act now. If they will not, they choose wrong way, because we will achieve, we will succeed, and we will not go back. We will not go back. We choose the way of freedom and dignity and democracy country, and we will reach to this point.
Karman says Western leaders are wrong if they think a popular Yemeni government would hurt their efforts to fight al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups operating in the country.
Ali Saleh and his regime, that they are the environment of terrorists and of al-Qaeda. We know that dictatorship means al-Qaeda, and we know also that we are the only one who interest and who will dry al-Qaeda and its resources. We are the future, and we believe that we have the responsibility to do that.
She says the youth in the Middle East are learning that peaceful protest is the best way to achieve their goals, not terrorism. At 32 years old, the journalist and mother of 3 is the youngest person to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
What is it inside of you that makes you do this, though?
The crisis around us, our country collapsed around us. There was a question, how can we save our country? And how can we be part of the solution, not problem?
The Nobel Committee says it gave Tawakkul Karman the Peace Prize for her nonviolent struggle, particularly on behalf of women. She says that struggle will continue. Al Pessin, VOA News, London.
European powers on the UN Security Council led condemnations on Tuesday against expanded Israeli settlement building and attacks by settlers on Palestinians. Their calls were echoed by nearly every other council member except the United States, amplifying the division among members of the UN's most powerful body on the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict. From the United Nations, VOA's Margaret Bashir reports.
In February, the United States was the only Security Council member to oppose a resolution condemning the building of Israeli settlements on Palestinian land, blocking the measure with its veto. On Tuesday, the U.S. was virtually the only council member to remain silent after a senior UN official warned the council that settler violence and settlement construction have been on the rise and are hurting the chance of a Mideast peace. Russian Ambassador Vitaly Churkin, who heads the council this month, told reporters that no consensus statement was possible from the 15-member council because of the objections of one delegation.
Because there is one delegation which would not want to hear anything about it, any kind of a statement, which believes that somehow things will sort of settle themselves somehow miraculously out of their own.
Churkin suggested that perhaps Israel occasionally needs prodding from the Security Council to act, and he noted that the stream of statements from ambassadors representing regional groups on the Security Council was a new development. The Europeans led the call for Israel's government to cease construction of settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem. Britain, France, Portugal, and Germany also condemned the disturbing escalation of violence by settlers, including the burning of mosques. British Ambassador Mark Lyle Grant, who read the European statement, said the package of measures announced by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in response to settler violence goes in the right direction, and that they anticipate its implementation. India, Brazil, and South Africa echoed the European concerns, as did ambassadors speaking on behalf of the group of more than 120 states known as the Non-Aligned Movement. Lebanon's ambassador, Nawaf Salam, spoke in his capacity as the chairman of the Arab group.
We are profoundly disappointed, frustrated by the inaction of the Security Council on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. Whatever you look at it, whether at the settlement activity, the demolition of houses, the evictions, you have there clear violations of international law, international humanitarian law, human rights law, the Charter of the UN, Security Council resolution, GA resolutions, opinion of the International Court of Justice.
Salam said the Security Council should live up to its responsibilities and condemn these activities. The United States has not declared Israeli settlement building illegal, but calls it illegitimate. Washington opposes efforts to legalize settlement outposts, which it considers unhelpful to the peace process. Israel's ambassador did not speak to reporters after the meeting, but in a statement, his spokeswoman criticized the council for focusing on Israeli settlements when it should, in her opinion, be vocal on events in Syria, Iran's alleged pursuit of nuclear weapons, and the activities of Hamas militants in the Gaza Strip. Peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians broke down 15 months ago over the issue of Israel's settlement building. Margaret Bashir, VOA News, the United Nations.
Turkey has detained several journalists as part of an anti-terror probe. Dorian Jones reports from Istanbul that domestic and international concern is growing about the number of journalists imprisoned in Turkey.
Turkish news channels broadcast pictures of journalists being taken into police custody after their homes were raided early Tuesday. The detentions are part of an anti-terror probe into what prosecutors allege is the press and propaganda wing of the banned Kurdish rebel group, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. A pro-Kurdish newspaper was also raided. The Turkish representative for the US-based Human Rights Watch, MS Sinclair Webb, says the latest developments are part of a worrying trend.
The arrests represent a further clampdown on dissenting critical voices in Turkey. This has become a pattern of the last few months. It's intensified since the general election. The trouble with Turkey's terrorism laws is that they're so widely drawn and vague that any of us can find ourselves a suspect in a terrorism investigation.
But Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan defends the ongoing probe, even making a thinly veiled threat against his critics, saying they should question their motives. The probe and another alleged conspiracy linked to the military, called a Genocon, have resulted in scores of journalists being jailed. The scale of the detentions has prompted the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to intervene. OSCE representative for media freedom, Dunja Mijatovic, met earlier this month with government officials.
There are more and more people put in prison, very long detention period, more than 1,000 days, sentences of 166 years in prison, so that at the end we had to intervene. Of course, this issue of imprisonment, it cannot be treated as a technical problem because we are talking about people behind bars, about human beings. My office clearly spelled out to the government that we do not want to in any way interfere with the legitimate right of any government to fight terrorism. But these cases of 66 at the moment, people that are journalists and that are in prison in Turkey, needs very urgent remedies.
Mijatovic says she received commitments from the government to reform, but was not given a timetable for change. The OSCE concern follows that of the European Union, which Turkey is seeking to join. The EU annual report on Turkey, published in October, criticised Ankara about freedom of press. But Turkish Minister for EU Affairs, Ergumen Bayish, dismissed the criticisms.
If you consider the report to be a photograph of Turkey, what I can say is the model of the camera that took the picture is an old model. I think it's time for Europe to change the lens, and they need to focus better.
Earlier this month, Turkey signed a protocol with Russia to combat what both countries claim is the politicization of human rights by international bodies such as the OSCE. The Turkish government argues that rather than restricting media freedom, it has allowed more critical reporting on the military, once a taboo subject. Political columnist Kaju Gusel for the Turkish daily Milliyet acknowledges such reforms, but argues that old taboos have merely been replaced by new ones.
There are new taboos erected. Reporting has become a quite difficult and ambiguous affair in Turkey, because reporting on questions that the government doesn't wish to see anything reported on it has become very risky.
The government's ending of the once omnipotent army's political power has seen Turkey being presented by some as a role model for emerging democracies of the Arab Spring and the wider region. But former Turkish ambassador and teacher of international relations at Kültür University, Murat Bilhan, says the journalists' detentions and the resulting intimidation in the wider society is a worrying sign about the direction Turkey is heading. He says the removal of democratic checks on the government could have major regional repercussions.
Turkey is changing for a civilian dictatorship now. If this continues like that, our allies and partners will feel it to their bones. Maybe a hostile Turkey, more Arabized Turkey, Turkey changing its identity.
The government dismisses such concerns, saying it's defending democracy rather than threatening it. But with more journalists jailed nearly every month, observers say that argument will prove increasingly hard to sustain. Dorian Jones for VOA News, Istanbul, Turkey.
Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has called on Kurdish authorities to hand over Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi, who is wanted on allegations of plotting to kill other government officials. Maliki made the plea at a news conference today in Baghdad, saying Hashimi must face the justice system. Hashimi, a Sunni, has denied the charges by the Shiite-led government, saying they are politically motivated. An Interior Ministry spokesman says the three of Hashimi's bodyguards confessed that they planted bombs targeting Iraqi government and security officials with Hashimi's backing. The alleged plot and a call last week by Maliki for a no-confidence vote in Parliament against another leading Sunni politician, Deputy Prime Minister Saleh al-Mutlaq, have heightened political tension in Iraq. On Tuesday, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden urged Iraqi leaders to settle their political differences. And finally, Afghan operators ran the first train downtown in Afghanistan's first major railroad Wednesday, paving the way for expanding trade in and out of the landlocked country. Deputy Public Works Minister Nurgul Mangal said the cargoless train arrived in the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif after a 75-kilometer trial run from the border with Uzbekistan. The Asian Development Bank funded the $165 million project. According to the group, the project will release a bottleneck that is now holding up the flow of goods in the mountainous country and improve the economy. The new mode of transportation also should speed up supplies coming for coalition troops battling the Taliban in Afghanistan. This has been VOA's Middle East Monitor. Join us Monday through Friday for news from the region, interest to the region, also on MiddleEastVoices.com. Coming up on International Edition, a political showdown looms in the DRC. We'll explain. Thanks for tuning in.
Are you following the uprisings in Syria, Egypt, and other Arab Spring countries? Want to contribute? Voice of America has launched a new social journalism website for the Arab Spring called Middle East Voices. Incubated by our thousands of fans on Facebook and Twitter and dedicated journalists at VOA, this site takes a new approach to covering the region through investigative journalism, publishing your viewpoints and harnessing social media to tell stories in a new, innovative way. Become a contributor at MiddleEastVoices.com.